Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Baltimore. In a new book called Billionaires and Ballot Bandits, Greg Palast outlines 9 easy steps to steal an election. So this is the first in a series of interviews we're going to do with Greg. So those of you that want to steal an election, listen closely. Thanks for joining us, Greg.
Thanks, Paul.
So, Greg Palast, as most of you probably know, he writes for Rolling Stone, he reports for BBC Television, Newsnight, he writes for The Nation, The Guardian, Harper's. So you have a new piece in The Nation, which is about how Mitt Romney and some of his friends made a lot of money out of the Detroit meltdown and the bailout. How did that happen?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a lot. I'd call it humongous. Okay, like monster money. I mean, in my neighborhood. Romney made between 15 million and 115 million. I want to repeat that, 115 million on the auto bailout.
That's a big spread, 15 to 1.
Well, when we try to ask him which it was, rather than I thought he was going to say I didn't make any money, he didn't deny it at all. So I suspect the numbers are all low.
Romney said he was opposed to the bailout.
I wrote an op-ed in the paper, and I said, absolutely not. Don't write a check for $50 billion.
But these documents reveal that a government bailout check was, in fact, cashed by none other than Ann Romney. It says that Ann Romney had a hunk of Mitt's vast fortune in Elliott Management, Paul Elliott Singer's vulture fund.
We know he made millions and millions and millions.
But you're saying at the very least 15.
At least 15.
So how?
But the important thing is that his buddies, his top donors, and his partners, 3 hedge fund managers, earned $4.2 billion off the auto bailout minimum. Here's how they did it. These guys grabbed the old Delco Auto Parts division of General Motors. It used to be called Delco, now it's called Delphi, a separate company. Delphi went into bankruptcy ahead of GM. These guys, Romney and his partners, bought up Delphi for 67 cents a share. Nothing.
Now, just to be clear here, this is Romney, this is Bain Capital doing this?
No, it's not. It's not Bain Capital. People think of Romney and Bain. He's left Bain. His partner is a guy named Paul Singer, better known as the Vulture. He runs a vulture fund called Elliott Management. They're not nice guys. Last time I was hunting these guys down for BBC, I was in the Congo, where Elliott Management, Paul Singer, figured out how to snatch aid money given to the Republic of Congo to help stop a cholera epidemic. And he figured out how to pocket it. I'm not kidding you.
All right, well, that's another story.
That's another story. Well, it's actually in Billionaires and Ballot Bandits, because I want people to understand who are the billionaires who are buying up these elections, who are the billionaires that are paying for the ballot thievery, and who are Romney's partners. By the way, I go through Obama's billionaires too, which is, that's part of the story too. They all got their billionaires, but this guy's a special case, the Vulture. So the Vulture, Singer, with his partner Romney, I should say the Ann Romney Blind Trust, or as I call it, the Blonde Trust, because it's not really a blind trust in any sense of the word. It's not recognized by the U.S. government at all as a blind trust. If I can see into it, so can Mr. Romney, who was a CEO of an investment bank, right? So they know what they're doing. These guys buy up the auto parts division of General Motors, 67 cents a share, secretly. The government doesn't know what's going to hit it. And they say, we own this thing, and if you don't give us what we want, which is almost $13 billion, we're going to shut down GM. We're shutting you down. That's a quote. In fact,
and they can do that because they're an important part supplier.
They used actually industrial espionage. They legal, as far as I could tell, which is that they hired General Motors purchasing executives to tell them where GM was vulnerable. And they found out that, for example, GM has no steering columns, no steering wheels. They would shut down like boom, because this is their own auto parts division. But they made it a separate company, stupidly. So they said, we're shutting down GM. And by the way, we'll take Chrysler down. When I say shut you down, they not put GM or Chrysler into bankruptcy. They're already going bankrupt. I'm talking about liquidating, finishing them off, so that they were doomed.
But how could they do that? What's the mechanism?
It's funny cars without steering wheels. It's hard to make them go in the right direction.
They can sink them because they simply
don't
supply
stop.
the parts.
They would fall apart immediately. So there was no replacement. They would need tens of, in fact, they went so far, Romney's partners, as to actually hand GM a study saying from your own purchasing agents, saying this will cost you tens of billions of dollars in several years to replace our parts. Well, of course, GM didn't have billions, even with the government, and it certainly didn't have years.
So this is all part of this period of the bailout and whether the government's going to buy these shares at the premium that...
Well, what they did was they said, no, just give us the money or you don't get the parts. The government with GM and the owner of the Detroit Pistons, a guy named Tom Gores, together, the Pistons, GM, and the government were going to buy back Delphi and make it, again, the old Delco Auto Parts division, because the government said, you can't have someone holding your parts. You know, it's a very uncomfortable biological situation. And so a deal was cut that would have saved most of the jobs. These guys said, we're shutting you down, give us our money. They got their money.
What year are we in?
We are in 2009. They got their money, and then between 2009 and 2011, even before that, they shut every single Delco parts plant in the United States except one, and fired every single UAW worker, everyone, 25,200 UAW members, and moved the entire operation to China. And that story didn't come out. It was from my investigation for billionaires and ballot bandits, and then we put it on the cover of Nation magazine.
Now, when did they buy the Delphi shares?
They bought the Delphi shares beginning right after Delphi went into official bankruptcy.
Which is?
In about 06, 07. And then Singer the Vulture moved in June of 2009. In 2 weeks, right after the government already announced the deal, the government had already announced that GM was buying back Delphi with the owner of the Pistons. It was done. And in those 2 weeks, he secretly bought up went around and secretly bought up old debts of the company, at least $1 billion face value of debt. Singer did.
Now, so how does it benefit if Romney's plan for GM had been followed, which is allowed to go into bankruptcy, don't give it emergency funding in the course of that process, which, if I understand correctly, is the main difference between the Obama plan and the Romney plan. How does that help Romney vis-a-vis Delphi?
First of all, he covered it up. So remember, Romney knew that the bailout was going through. He knew this money would be there. Don't forget, it wasn't Obama that created the bailout. Obama's prancing around giving himself medals for the auto bailout. That was George Bush. It was Bush who created TARP. It was Bush who created the auto bailout operation, though it was Obama who created the auto team, did the final negotiations. So Romney knew this was a cheap shot. In other words, he could say, oh, well, I'm against the auto bailout. The term he used was, Detroit doesn't need a check, it needs a turnaround. Well, they got the check, and Romney cashed it. In fact, his campaign has not denied that he profiteered. He says it's Obama's fault, believe it or not. It's Obama's fault that Romney got really, really rich, probably about $115 million extra in his pocket, because he said, basically, Romney's a smart businessman.
And where did Romney acknowledge this?
He sent an email to the newsletter, The Hill, which is the
and The Hill's printed this.
The Hill has printed the Romney campaign's statements, verifying that he earned a big profit.
Now, you would think this would be a big story. If I understand correctly, there's a presidential election going on, and I believe Mitt Romney's a candidate. You would think this would be a mainstream news story, and people would all jump on it. Well, but they're not.
Well, let me explain something. You have to turn around. There's a sign behind it that says "the real news." See, what we get on in mainstream news in America is unreal news, info news, infotainment.
But wouldn't the pro-democratic Party press, of which a lot of it is, wouldn't they jump all over
They
this?
don't want to touch anything that involves going after the billionaires. And let's not forget that there are 3 billionaires here. One of them, Dan Loeb, was Obama's biggest donor 4 years ago, richest donor 4 years ago. Now he's switched over to Romney. But you know, there's too many complexities here. However, I will say the Obama campaign did spread around my story, I noticed. I certainly don't like politicians using my stuff, but go ahead. You know, it's a free country. And still no one would touch it. And I mean, one of the things is that I work for BBC TV. A story like this, all my stories at BBC TV are the top of the nightly news. And I write my stories for the Guardian newspapers. It is the front page of the biggest, most influential newspaper in the world that goes all over the planet, except the USA. So these
well, the Guardian Online's big in the USA. It's
yeah,
so I think it's one of the top 5 news sites in the country.
For good reason, because you don't get real news except here or the Guardian and BBC. And to me, I must admit, I'm actually quite stunned. And now this book I wrote with Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy is my co-investigator at Rolling Stone, and he's a law professor. So he wrote a couple of chapters of this book. And he's just stunned himself. We can't get close to the American mainstream media. They don't want to touch it. They don't want to do anything that involves, basically, as they call it, class warfare.
Well, we can do a whole segment on that.
Yeah.
All right. If you want to see more detail of this article, The Nation has printed the article. It's based on a chapter in the book, and the Nation article is called.
The Nation article is called Mitt Romney's Bailout Bonanza, and in the book, in Billionaires and Ballot Bandits, it's called Restore the Billionaire's Future.
Okay, great. We'll do, I believe, below this video player you're watching us in, there'll be a link to the article. Thanks for joining us, Greg.
You're very welcome.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.